January 1945. Nazi Germany is in a disaster on an apocalyptic scale. Their invasion of the Soviet Union, all the way back in 1941, has proven to be a mistake, to say the least. After the initial shock of the invasion, the Soviets have regrouped and are overwhelming the Wehrmacht all across the Eastern Front. With millions lying dead behind them, the Soviet Red Army has finally entered German territory and is racing towards Berlin with millions of angry soldiers. In the West, things aren't much better. In the 7 months following the Allied invasion of France at D-Day, the Allies have liberated large swaths of Western Europe from German occupation and are now knocking on the door of Germany itself. Germany is being crushed between the weight of massive armies that are all united in their desire to make the Nazis pay for their countless crimes. To make matters worse, German cities and infrastructure are in ruins. The Allies have carried out unrelenting bombing campaigns against German cities that have left most of them in rubble. Germany is hopelessly doomed, and yet the Wehrmacht keep fighting. When Hitler ordered his last-ditch effort to turn the tide back in his favor with the disastrous Ardennes offensive, the mad dictator had finally exhausted his resources to carry out any more major offensives. So why hasn't Germany just surrendered? Or why hasn't the German army abandoned Hitler and saved themselves? The first of several answers was the German fear of the Soviet Union. When Hitler had found himself in prison for trying to overthrow the German government in 1923, he used his abundance of free time to put into words his political evolution and his future plans for Germany in his manifesto called Mein Kampf. He explains how Germany needed Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people to survive. To achieve this goal, Germany needed to find and conquer vast amounts of territory, and Hitler had the perfect place in mind: Russia. In Hitler's twisted mind, the Slavic peoples that made up large portions of the Soviet Union were nothing more than subhumans and needed to be exterminated and/or enslaved in order to make room for the Germans who would soon repopulate the territory, an idea he never lost faith in. On March 30th, 1941, 2 months before Operation Barbarossa, Hitler called a meeting with high-level military officials to explain how the Wehrmacht should conduct themselves during the upcoming invasion of the USSR. He explained that this war was going to be different, for this war was a war of extermination. The German armed forces were to be as ruthless and bloodthirsty as possible, and crimes against Russian civilians would be ignored in most cases. Unfortunately, the Wehrmacht followed orders. As over 3 million Germans poured over the Russian border, Soviet soldiers, civilians, both men and women, children and elderly, were subjected to the most horrific side of human beings. In the 4 years that the Nazis and Soviets waged war with one another, the Russian people were left with 27 million dead. The Soviets were in shock. But Germany's brutal slaughter of the Russian people came with a serious consequence, as the Germans massacred their way deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, never showing a hint of mercy. The Soviet will to fight to the bitter end got stronger and stronger. After the decisive battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, the Soviets had finally begun to push the Germans back in 1943. Knowing that the tide was turning and that revenge was on the horizon, the Soviets resolved to brutalize the Germans all the way back to Berlin, no matter the cost. As the Soviets pounded Germany with a seemingly endless ocean of humanity, the Wehrmacht started to buckle. The Germans were steadily being pushed back until on October 21st, 1944, when the Soviet Red Army finally captured Nimmersdorf, a small German settlement on the edge of the original German border in eastern Prussia. Here, the Soviets gave the Germans a preview of what they had in store for the German people. The Soviets were only able to control the small village for less than 48 hours, but these 48 hours would be the last for dozens of German civilians as they were violated and murdered by the vengeful Red Army. When the German army discovered what had happened at Nimmersdorf, the Nazi propaganda ministry thought that publicizing the massacre to the German people would further dehumanize the Soviets in their eyes, and drive them to volunteer to fight. Though it did encourage some to volunteer, the terrifying images and descriptions of the massacre caused widespread panic as people in eastern Germany tried to run for their lives. Nimmersdorf was just the beginning, however. As the Soviets started flooding into Germany, more and more reports started spreading of Soviet crimes against the German people. This would create a deep terror in the minds of the German soldiers of what would happen if they surrendered or failed to stop the Soviets. Themselves, their wives, mothers, fathers, and children would all be defenseless against the Soviet Union, and the Soviets were in no mood for mercy, so the Germans kept fighting. But the Soviet Union wasn't the only thing preventing the Wehrmacht from surrendering. for behind every German soldier was the loaded gun of the Nazi high command. In 1934, only a year after he came into power, Adolf Hitler made a change in the German military that would have deadly consequences during World War II. Every German soldier had to swear an oath of loyalty directly to Hitler himself, with a clause that promised, quote, unconditional obedience. So, when the war turned against Germany and Hitler started to lose his appeal, the German soldiers would discover just how serious their personal oaths to Hitler were. When a German soldier tried to abandon his post or performed a minor act of insubordination, they would suffer the most extreme consequences, with upwards of 65,000 German soldiers being executed by the men they called comrades. And this doesn't take into account the unknown number of men who were killed on the spot for failing to follow orders. So, with the Soviet Union beating down their door to the east and their own government holding them hostage, what was left for the average German soldier experiencing what to them must have seemed like the end of the world? Hope. Do not misunderstand me. They, or at least very few of the German soldiers, had any hope at all of winning the war by 1945. Despite the Nazi government's desperate promises of some kind of wonder weapon, that was always just a short time away from production. No, by 1945, the German army was hopeless for victory. Their only hope lay in the mercy of the West. But with every second that Hitler breathed, the Wehrmacht knew that all they had left to do was to fight and die. For as long as he lived, surrender was never an option, and absolute defeat was inevitable. A realization that many of Germany's high-ranking military officers had by 1944. During the course of Hitler's reign of terror, there were no fewer than 42 attempts to end Hitler's life, but they all failed. Perhaps the most well-known of these attempts was Operation Valkyrie, which also had the biggest impact in Germany's fate in 1945. When assassins detonated a bomb in Hitler's Wolf's Lair on July 20th, 1944, Hitler's assassins thought he was finally dead. As Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators attempted to overthrow the Nazi government, they soon learned that Hitler was indeed very much alive. When news of Hitler's survival spread, the hunt was on for anyone who had, or was suspected of having had, anything to do with the failed plot. In the end, almost 5,000 people were executed in retaliation for the plot, which ultimately secured Hitler's position as the leader of the Nazi Party until the bitter end. The plot backfired further for the conspirators when Hitler would remark, quote, "Having escaped death in so extraordinary a way, I am now more than ever convinced that the great cause which I serve will survive its present perils, and that everything can be brought to a good end." End quote. With Hitler firmly in place at the top and his resolve in the war at an all-time high, the Wehrmacht were forced to fight on in a war that grew more hopeless and desperate by the day. As the calendar slowly flipped to 1945, the German situation only worsened. For the last 10 months of the war, from July 1944 to May 1945, would be an absolute bloodbath for the Germans. In these last terrible months, 2.6 million German soldiers would die, or half of all German military deaths that occurred during the entire war. Another 1 million German civilians would be killed in addition, meaning that for every month the war drug on, 350,000 Germans would die. It is safe to say that the German army and most of the German people were very much aware that the war was lost much earlier than 1945. But the crimes that the German armed forces committed in the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe would make surrendering all but impossible, as their enemies hungered for revenge. And as the Allies began to gain the upper hand, Hitler's refusal to relinquish power or surrender became the nail in the coffin for millions of people, until finally the German army could not stop the inevitable and were forced to surrender unconditionally. Thank you for watching this video. Comment if you learned something, and do not forget to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.